Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for being here today. I'm very honored to be able to moderate this panel on ethics and human rights. I think as we're thinking about developing a new way that people will communicate, interact with one another, conduct business, a new way for governments to interact with their constituents, there's probably no more important topic than human rights and ethics. So should be a good conversation today. I'm very pleased to be joined by Britton Heller remotely, a fellow at the Atlantic Council. Slater, who is, you're in Barcelona right now, aren't you, Mel? Yes, okay. Distinguished investigator at the University of Barcelona, Rouse, to my right, associate professor at the University of Skövde. Is that right?
It's Skövde.
Okay, that's close.
It's great.
Yeah. And Sam Gregory, program director of Witness. So with that, I thought a good way to sort of open the conversation here would be to hear from each of you a little bit about the work that you're doing, and specifically your thoughts on human rights in the context of technology. I mean, we discuss human rights in all different types of contexts. With respect to technology specifically, what do we mean when we talk about human rights? So if, Rebecca, if you'd like to begin.
I could share that some of my research has examined and critiqued the concept of the empathy machine in VR and games, and trying to dig deep into those concepts and understand what are the underlying values and assumptions. There's a lot of interest and goodwill in creating projects in VR and other XR technologies that will make the world a better place. I think a lot of people just want to make the world a better place, and that's great. But I think it's important that we look very carefully at research in terms of how social change actually happens, the complexity of that, and then really temper the claims we make about some of the work we design in XR. So that's maybe a little overview of some of my perspective.
Okay. And how does human rights specifically factor into that? I mean, we'll get into all of this in much deeper detail, but in terms of social good and human rights, what does that mean for technology?
Well, I think one slice of it that I've looked at is projects where people want to give voice to folks who have been silenced or oppressed. And sometimes the way that happens isn't so great. Sometimes that happens in a way that just kind of enriches the creator, the designer. It doesn't actually impact the marginalized community. And then those projects may become hyper visible. And then other folks may feel that there's no need to act because goals have been achieved. So that's some of the corner of this really huge topic that I've looked at. Thank you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Gregory, and I work at a human rights group called Witness. Actually, explaining a little bit about that, I'll explain some of the context of how I think about human rights and technology and XR. So Witness helps people who use video and technology in their human rights work. We're a somewhat unusual organization that a lot of our work is working very directly with people who use the tools. So for example, people who film police violence or document war crimes in Ukraine. And then another part of our work is really thinking about the emerging technologies that may end up in the hands of those human rights activists, those civic journalists, and how do you intervene early to ensure that they're aligned with their needs. So when it comes to human rights and technology, there are a bunch of areas that are sort of add to sort of the cauldron that is XR, right? So we work on anonymity, we work on media manipulation and deepfakes, we work on authenticity and trust, we work on video. And when I think about human rights and technology, I think there's three things that are really important to think about, and they're independent actually of XR, right? The first is no technology emerges out of nothing. They're almost always an evolution out of existing problems, existing problematics of technology. So when I look at XR, I think about existing problematics about video, existing problematics around deepfakes, existing problematics around trust. So we don't get into a kind of what one academist called the one medium fallacy. We just obsess on one technology and not think about the spectrum of it. The second is, who do we center in the discussion on human rights and technology and when? And XR is a tremendously good example of technologies that are getting baked right now, the hardware being built, the infrastructure being designed, largely without the input of the people who perhaps have things to benefit from and certainly have a lot to lose given what we know about privacy, discrimination, freedom of expression in the development. So in fact, process matters when it comes to human rights and technology. And I'm happy to talk more about process and what we've learned around this. We've done a lot of work around process and phenomena like deepfakes, which have a lot of proximity to XR. So excited to be here and to talk more.
Thank you. Britton, over to you. Tell us about what you're working on and your thoughts on technology as it relates to human rights.
Hi, everybody. My name is Britton Heller. I am an international human rights lawyer who found herself swept up in technology 15 years ago. I started my career as a prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, where I prosecuted genocide and war crimes, and then went to the US Department of Justice, where I did the same, but had a special role as the computer hacking and IP specialist, looking at how technology really intersected with traditional human rights harms, threats not only to people's dignity, but to their privacy and their safety. The things that I'm going to be teaching international law at Stanford in the wintertime. And so I'm looking forward to getting a little bit back to my roots. What I've been working on over the last few months have been a few things. One is the way that current laws protecting privacy and human rights are not a clean fit with the hardware development that we see in XR. Specifically, how the hardware development has limited the total addressable market for very important groups like women, racial and ethnic minorities, and disabled populations. The second thing that I've been working on are conceptions of mental privacy. So how our traditional human rights conceptions of privacy are centered more around identity than concepts of inferences made about our behavior and thoughts, which are completely where XR is going, and the need to revamp that. And finally, I've been looking at very important issues like the advent of user-generated content, the impact of different potential business models on the industry, and the need to do more. This is why I wore my pearls, than just in this clutcher of pearls and say we shouldn't have this, but to talk about what this would be and what an alternative would look like functionally. Because do we want to say no advertising? Do we want to say yes to targeted advertising? If you look at the mechanisms that underlie some of these phenomena and what advertising has looked like in the industry, it's not a clean question, and that's very interesting. So I'm talking to you today from rainy Vermont, where I came via Brussels, where I came via Estonia. So it's great to be here.
Thank you, Britton. Happy to have you here. And Mel, finally over to you for your thoughts on the same question, please.
Hi, I'm Mel Slater. Thanks very much for inviting me. So I've been carrying out research continuously in virtual reality for like a really long time. And my research has focused on the illusion of presence. That's the illusion that you have that the place that the virtual reality depicts is where you are, and also embodiment, which means that we can substitute a virtual body for your real body, and you can have the illusion that the virtual body is yours. So that's like, let's say on the pure research side, but on the application side, we've been applying this technology again for many years in areas of clinical psychology and also to improve pro-social behavior. So for example, a recent experiment we did was actually in a United States Police Department, where we addressed the issue of police bias against African Americans. So what are the kind of human rights or ethical problems? Of course, virtual reality can influence what you take as being real or not real. What the techniques we use for the good, I think, can probably be used for the bad. There's also the possibility of confusion between real and virtual worlds. So you learn something in virtual reality, which is false, but nevertheless you assume automatically without really thinking about it that this applies in the real world. For example, in virtual reality, you see a particular person, a virtual person who insults you, and then when you see that person in the real world, you can't but help having bad thoughts about that particular person. And the other issue, which I think is very important, is the whole issue of in things like the metaverse, they'll be tracking everything you do, where your head is, where your eyes are, how your facial expression is, how your body moves, but also they know where you are and what you're looking at. And if we think of the massive amount of data that will be collected both individually and on the mass, and apply machine learning algorithms, machine learning methods to that data, they can, whoever they are, I don't know yet, can predict a huge amount about you, especially if your profile is tied up with another online profile that says things about you. So these are the things that interest me in this domain. And also there's other issues to do with augmented reality as well, which are related.
I think just like with any tool, there's, as we've already said, there's the potential for good and there's the potential for ill. Depending on how it's used, it's not the technology itself necessarily, but how it's employed and the intent behind that. So I think, when we're talking about human rights, we tend to look for abuses or problems or shortcomings necessarily because we want to make sure that we're supporting human rights and solving problems. But there are also positive stories. And one of them, I think, with respect to XR technology in particular, is the development of empathy. Some have called VR the ultimate empathy machine. Mel, if I can stick with you for a moment here, I know that you've recently done some studies around empathy in virtual reality. Can you tell us something about that?
Yes, so what we've concentrated on more is embodiment, meaning that you adopt in virtual reality, the body of a particular group. Nothing particularly is happening. You just look in the mirror, virtual mirror, you see your body moving and so on. And what we find, and this has been replicated at least 5 times now, that when you do that, you have a reduction in implicit racial bias against that group. However, we've also looked at, and this has got in itself nothing to do with empathy, we've also looked at the idea of the empathy machine. Basically, the idea of the empathy machine is that you embody people in the body of a member of in quotes, an out group, a disadvantaged group, that you're subjected to the kind of indignities that members of that group might feel. And the idea is that this improves empathy. However, what we found when we did this is that, of course, in that situation, you're also subject to stress. And when you're stressed, you don't learn. And what we found actually is that in that situation, whatever your explicit views might be, your implicit bias nevertheless worsens towards that group. So while the idea of the empathy machine is a very good and important one and certainly worth following up, I think it has to be treated with some suspicion sometimes, or not with suspicion, with caution is the right way to think of this. So, I mean, this is just basically the evidence we have from the very last experiment we did on this, because my feeling has always been that empathy is not necessarily the answer. You're walking along the street, someone's asking for money, you have a moment of empathy, maybe you give them some money, but you don't invite them back to your house. Empathy doesn't necessarily lead to a change in behavior. So I just think it's a cautionary tale.
Yeah, thank you. Sam, I know that Witness has done some work around this as well. And I think it's very interesting to think about how the viewer comes to understand violations of human rights, whether they find that offensive or if there's, on some level, there's an acceptance there. Can you tell us more about your findings?
Sure, thank you. And I have to admit, I'm a skeptic of the empathy machine phrase. With a lot of respect to Mel's research that is very much grounded a lot of what we've thought about in this space, and we've thought about a lot through this idea of immersive advocacy. So what is the point of immersing people in situations, either by themselves or with others, when you think about it from a social change perspective? And the starting point is that most people want to resist being exposed to other people's suffering, right? There's a lot of scholarship on denial. And there are some ways in which immersion supports, challenges that, right? Like the sort of the texture of reality that you might experience in a different situation, the feeling of proximity. But it doesn't really deal with the fundamental problems of the opportunity really just to be a spectator into other people's reality that a lot of virtual reality to date has presented. We, in our work in this, and we've probably worked for about 5 or 6 years looking at what we describe as co-presence, which is probably best experienced when you think about social VR, or you think about perhaps the potential of augmented reality. That is the ability across distance to share spaces and to act together in a mutually beneficial way. And I think that is the direction, if you're thinking about the social change potential of VR and AR, is to think, what is it that we do that bridges distances in a way that is equitable, in a way that is not spectatorship, that is not about perpetuating the power dynamics of someone gets to watch and someone gets watched, often without knowing they're being watched, right, or without knowing what is happening. And so I think if we look ahead, that's from the point of view of human rights advocacy, we should be thinking, how do we use the potential of social VR? That's a space where you can coexist with other people and interact, and distance and proximity is reduced. And the possibility of AR, where we might be able to see different layers across our reality and interact at a distance with others. So as I look at that, I think that's where the potential is, if we want to look at immersive advocacy, is to understand that, but not to get too, not to assume also, and this will be the final thing I'd say, that empathy is what we want. I think empathy is probably the least desirable emotion actually in advocacy. It's like a very poor substitute for, say, solidarity, right? So if we're going to think about what we want to do, we might want to be standing next to people, not embodied as them, right? Like we want to be standing next to them, or perhaps standing one step behind them if we're in a human rights struggle, right? So again, just thinking about positionality as we enter spaces, and then of course, who's going to be allowed into those spaces, right? Who has access? We're going to move into those access questions, and that might influence, of course, who can stand front and who can stand behind.
Rebecca, you've also done work in this space and talked about empathy. Do you agree with what Sam's saying about empathy versus solidarity? I know you do a lot of work around storytelling. How would you describe that relationship between the viewer and the participant?
Well, I do agree with a lot of what you're sharing, and I think that there's something I just want to point out about VR versus AR for a second, which you were building on there, which is, simulation is really important, especially for things that are really dangerous, right? Like we've seen people talk today about simulation in terms of training our soldiers or other kind of very dangerous tasks, expensive, dangerous tasks. Getting to be in dialogue with someone who's different from you is not dangerous. It's uncomfortable, maybe, right? So removing the other person from that completely to kind of more fully protect the privileged person from feeling uncomfortable is a huge misstep. And so what you're bringing up in terms of mixed reality, where we could be together with people who are different from us, like actually together, maybe there is some kind of digital overlay that's helping to facilitate a dialogue. I think that's absolutely where there's a lot of promise. But the other model has been kind of really popularized, right? And it is very seductive and attractive because of that kind of layer of protection that plays into things like white fragility so nicely. And also this notion of a kind of singular broadcast media that could be just distributed seamlessly and quickly and maybe more cheaply to many, many people to change minds kind of in a minute. But this is really a fantasy, right? Like which Mel has shown in his research too. So I'm really happy to hear those different perspectives. And in terms of storytelling, I think we get really complicated quickly because the politics of telling other people's stories is super fraught. It has been. You can think back to like Charles Dickens writing about Oliver Twist. These are really problematic, right? And so maybe it comes around to process again. And that part of what needs to happen in developing XR to improve human rights and equity in the world is that people who are oppressed need to be centered in the process. And actually, other designers, privileged designers like me, need to do things like step aside to make space and work to make the sector more accessible for other people to come in and be the designers.
Thank you. All right, well, we've talked about at least some of the potential benefits and ways that XR technology can advance human rights, but we probably should discuss some of the challenges as well. Britton, over to you. You've written a lot, obviously, on biometric psychography. In fact, you coined the term, and it's something that's widely discussed. Can you tell us more about that work and how that concept intersects with human rights?
Sure, happy to discuss it. When I was a fellow at Harvard Kennedy School from 2019 to 2020, and studying what content moderation would look like in immersive contexts. And I found that it was very, very different than social media. And this sounds obvious, but it's something that I feel the need to emphasize and repeat for people who are trying to write policies or laws around this space. It's not social media. So I anticipated a harm that I think I can illustrate best with an anecdote. Pretend that Joan and I are playing a car racing game. And I really, really like this red Ferrari. Ooh, it's really nice. And my pupils dilate and my heart rate gets a little faster and my skin gets a little more moist. And the head-mounted device and all of the associated hardware I'm wearing pick up on this. Later on, I start getting advertisements in my social media feed about why now is a great time to buy a used car. A red car driven by the person who looks kind of like my husband and my crush drives by. In the next time I play the game, I start getting ads in my social media feed and in my email about why now's a great time to get Geico car insurance. This is what I mean by biometric psychography. It comes from two different terms. I use biometric because in XR, we use sensors to orient ourselves in space, to decrease latency, and to really make this hardware work. It's based off of anatomical measurements, like our blink rate and our pupil dilation and our galvanic skin response, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you combine that with psychography, which is a term from advertising that means your commercial likes, dislikes, and preferences, then I think we have the potential for a whole new class of harm. The type of information that you can get from bodily measurements, and I'm saying bodily measurements instead of biometrics, because under the law, a lot of this information is not covered by legal protections governing biometrics. But the type of information you can get from that can be extraordinarily intimate in a way that I don't think users are aware of. First, it can tell whether or not you're likely to be telling the truth. I interviewed one of the pioneers of the hardware who said, why would you want to put a polygraph with 6 cameras on your face? And I've never forgotten that. Second, it can tell whether or not you have physiological responses, like if you're sexually attracted to a person. Third, it can tell whether or not you show preclinical signs of medical ailments, like schizophrenia, ADHD, Huntington's, or Parkinson's disease. And I don't know about you, but that's not the type of information that I feel like I can consent away when I play an XR experience. My argument is that you can't consent to give away involuntary data that you may not even know is contained or know about yourself yet. So that's the concept in a nutshell.
I think that's a really important point, that you might not even be aware of the information that you're sharing. So how do you meaningfully consent to the collection of that information? I think another point that has been raised in terms of the user of the technology not being fully aware is the notion of deepfakes, which we are seeing in 2D technology, but that could have a greater or different impact in immersive environments. Rebecca, do you have thoughts around how to protect ourselves against deepfakes? Is there a new level of digital literacy that's required? Or is it pretty much the same thing as what we're experiencing now?
I think just very quickly, I wanted to touch on what Britton was sharing, if I could, because I think the just to say sort of a footnote as an academic, the history of measuring people is not great. And we shouldn't forget that. So for example, like one of the first step trackers was secretly put in Napoleon's watch by his doctor to spy on him. He didn't know, he didn't consent. There's a long history of measuring people and their movement and their bodies without consent and misusing that data, for predictive kinds of actions in really bad ways. So I just wanted to footnote to remember that. And Jacqueline Werennemont has a great book on this called Numbered Lives that I recommend if people are curious. In terms of deepfakes, I think digital literacy absolutely is important. However, there's limits. And maybe we'll actually, ironically, need AI assistive tools to help us determine whether these things are fake or not. Because, I mean, we can't kind of see that, right? I mean, we can read and assess information in a newspaper in one way that's totally different from looking at a video deepfake that we see today.
It might be AI comes to the rescue in some ways to alert us to that, because it's already so difficult to distinguish in video form and 2D. Like, when you're experiencing that with presence, it's really going to raise some interesting questions for sure. That brings me to another question about trust and trust models. What is it going to take for people to trust this technology, to feel comfortable using it, to feel like they're not being exploited or taken advantage of in some way? We've discussed a little bit about how it has the potential to do great good in society, but people won't use the technology if they feel like they're being deceived or they don't understand how the technology works. So we have, models for AI trustworthiness. Is that something that we should have for XR as well? And that's open to anyone who would like to comment.
I think that when you talk about transparency and related to tech policy, I like to divide it into two camps. And one is specific transparency and one is general transparency. And so my challenge to the group here is to be more specific about what we mean when we say transparency than we were when we were talking about social media or ethical AI. Specific transparency is, I define that as the way that a policy applies to an individual user. So very akin to user education or the individualization of these policies and their application. General transparency is more information about the business model and the processes and policies of these companies. I often see that companies, when called on to provide further transparency, provide more general transparency. Users are demanding more specific transparency. And so they're going by like ships in the night, and both parties are getting really, really frustrated. I think in this case, you need a mixture of both. And that is Arturo in the past panel was talking about rebuilding public trust in technology. And I think that's one of the necessary ways to do that, to mix both specific and general transparency. When we ask questions about this technology, their role in our lives, their role with our bodies, and how they impact our human rights.
I think we should open up for questions, audience questions.
I want to talk about Ferrari, and thank you. I want to talk about the Ferrari example, and I'm coming from a place of ignorance. When I draft something, a document, I leave it on my computer so it doesn't go out on the internet until I'm ready to post it on the internet. With this new experience, this XR experience, I'm assuming that what you're describing is a situation where the program itself is out there and reads your biometric data, and therefore your biometric data is out there. Is it even feasible to make that aspect of the program internal to the physical unit so that the biometric data doesn't actually leave the unit and go out into the air? Is that
So-
even possible?
That's a really good question. One of the ways that XR technology is different than your computer is that it creates a record not only of your reaction to stimuli, but the stimuli itself all in one. And so it already exists in order for the hardware to function, which is different than the way your computer works. Or if you're talking about my computer, it doesn't work. So I think that looking at best practices in the storage, application, and collection of data, you pointed out the number one. The number one is having data stored locally on a device, so that if law enforcement gets a warrant or a 2703D order to access that information, they have to actually physically go to the place where that is stored. I think the upcoming challenge for all of this is the move to cloud storage. So 5G and cloud storage are going to really push the innovation curve on this forward. There's a lot of consumer demand to have your smart glasses take more than a 30-second video. It will increase the experience for a lot of people. There'll be less latency. Mel can tell us if that will impact the presence, immediacy, and immersive aspects of it. But at the same time, it will mean that if I was still a prosecutor, I could go to the cloud computing provider to get that information. It opens up the surface where your personal data will be exposed. You'll be giving it to third parties. So we're really at an inflection point right now, because that is in the foreseeable business model of every hardware company. And you have to ask, how does that change the game when we think about privacy and human rights? I think that was a great question. Thank you.
I'd like to.
I just want to add hardware functionality. So yes, that's all true, but it's also possible in some cases, some use cases, for the data or the received information from the sensors to be used and not stored by the device alone. So there's all kinds of different ranges of possibilities as far as how the data is received, used, where it's stored, and how it's stored.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah, I'd like to add something. So first of all, I think the Ferrari example is a really good one, an important one, and it's even worse than it seems. Because, for example, imagine your profile on the virtual reality or augmented reality device is also connected with your Twitter. And so they may know some of your political views, and your body movements and eye dilations and so on can be tied up with your political ideas, and they can predict what people's politics are from how their body moves. And okay, you might say, so what? But in some societies that could be really dangerous. Or you're in the real street using augmented reality and you walk past a particular political poster, and it's immediately known that you like that or you don't like that, and that may have very severe consequences for your life in some societies. Now, on the question of is it necessary, can data be stored locally? The answer is yes, but this is not the policy of the companies who distribute it. It can be stored, yes, because if we take the way most virtual reality devices work, it's all real time. So you put on the head-mounted display, there's cameras, they build up a picture of your environment. From that picture of the environment, it uses computer vision algorithms to know where your head is. It may also be tracking your eyes and so on. But all of this is used instantaneously, or as close to instantaneously as possible, so that you have low latency. It's then a question of what the company's policy is. Is it stored on the device? There's no reason for it to be stored at all, because it's all real time. It's used as it's obtained. Further than that, not only is it stored on the device, is it put in the cloud? Does it go back to the company? So as far as I know, companies do operate in the way that this data does in some way, or at least some of it, go back to the company. This may be regulated so that this is not allowed, or you have to explicitly buy into that, just like you have to, when you're using a computer that says, do you want bug reports to be sent back to the manufacturer? It's your choice, yes or no. Well, the same could be applied to this. Do you want your real-time movement data and eye tracking data to be sent back to the company to improve your experience? Yes or no? If you say no, it shouldn't be sent back. But there's no intrinsic reason why this data has to be stored or transmitted anywhere in the way that the devices work.
So I have one question about regarding mental health. 5 years ago, there was a problem that the drones pilots, the Air Force drone pilots in the middle of the United States, they are flying missions over Afghanistan and Iraq, and they develop PTSD. Now I'm going to this Hara example. I'm racing. I like racing. Actually, I do like drive fast. And I have this experience, virtual experience, that I have an accident and I have somebody with me that does not cut me off because I don't die in accident, and I saw the person dying horrible in the accident. How am I going to be protecting this person about PTSD? Because now you can, because you are completely immersed in the virtual reality, you may actually believe it. Your brain may actually understand that you got this accident and build up this memory later on. So how we going to be thinking about, okay, we become too real, and where is the limits? Because you can actually harm the person that is playing or using the device.
Anyone in particular?
Yeah. Yes. So it's. Can you hear me? Yeah. So one of the biggest applications of virtual reality has been the other way around, which is using virtual reality to help people with PTSD, like veterans and so on. And of course, it's double-edged because you could, just as you say, use virtual reality to induce trauma in people. So this is really a matter of ethics or legal constraints over what you should be allowed and not be allowed to show people. For example, I know a story of somebody who went to a meeting. They said, hey, come and try our virtual reality. She put on the head-mounted display and she was involved in an execution and she got traumatized by that. So this just shouldn't be allowed, end of story. I mean, the positive uses of this, so of course, virtual reality can be used to help people with PTSD, but also it can be used to induce PTSD, as you say. But this is really a matter of societal regulation.
I'd also like to add that the way that experiences interact with your neurology, there's still a lot of research to be done. And that's not to discount what you're saying. I think it's just to add frosting on the cupcake. In these PTSD experiences that help veterans, one of the most common scenarios is a night raid, because that was reported by many veterans who were in Afghanistan and Iraq from the US military to be one of the most stressful experiences. The authors of these VR experiences decided to make them representative rather than realistic. So that it could be generally applicable to many people's experiences instead of uniquely applicable to one or two. And they found that basically your brain fills in the contours. And so I think what you're kind of what underlies your question too is how are we going to deal with the personalization of experiences and data, because that can be quite powerful. I've produced AR and VR experiences.
We still can't get you on video.
Joan,
I was just gonna say, we have some models from other media that certainly aren't perfect, but we could look to in terms of content.
Now, and where they went to school, and allowed them to draw the inferences that I was hoping they would get in a way that they took with them in a way that if I had just told them in a conference or in a white paper, they wouldn't. But at the same time, you really do need to understand how people's brains tick on this, where it's very counterintuitive to think the more cartoony I make it, the more real it's going to seem. We don't know if that's always the case, but in the case of these PTSD studies, it was true. So I think you brought up a very important point about the personalization of experiences and the somatic and mental impact that has on us uniquely. Also, I won't let you crash in the game. I'm a terrible driver.
Tim, did you have any?
I did, Rebecca, did you want to?
Well, I was just gonna say that we have, some examples that aren't perfect, but we can look to in other media in terms of content warnings and rating systems. And think about, if a theater play is gonna have strobe lighting or gunshot effects, there's gonna be a sign posted out front in the US at least, and in Europe probably too. You could think about rating systems for film and games. I mean, these aren't perfect, but they could give a starting point for sure.
I'll add, and obviously I work in a field where vicarious trauma is a huge issue, right? We look at human rights footage or document that. The connection I would draw is actually a huge issue that we're not touching on here, which is around content moderation. And how do we think about shared VR spaces, personalized AR spaces? How does content moderation apply there? And the reason I draw the connection is we know that there are huge issues with trauma for content moderators who engage in scenarios where that are traumatizing, that are and they often do it in very decontextualized ways that don't allow them to see resolution. They do it rapidly without an ability to decompress. So if we think about VR space, we think about some of the impact on individuals in those spaces that Britton's describing. We have a hugely complex area around content moderation broadly with VR and AR, and all kinds of different trajectories, and we shouldn't remove the question of how you deal with, in fact, that a lot of content moderation is actually content moderation of incidents in spaces that are traumatic. And that's the whole point of content moderation, is to do that. But it's really challenging, and probably more challenging the more immersive the space.
I have a hypothesis, which I'd like you all to diss. And basically it is that the death. I am. Okay, this is the first time I've ever spoken publicly, so bear with me. Okay, so my hypothesis is this, that the sheer amount and variant, there are different types of personal data in various immersive technologies will be overwhelming for those companies that have to protect those variants of personal data, the biometric data, et cetera. And that could be the end of that business model. If I wanted to incentivize the end of that business model, okay, right now, the way we've tried to do it is the traditional route of protecting human rights, which is to say each country establishes its personal data protection rights. But maybe there's another way to do that, to incentivize going away from that, which could in the long run yield a better approach to metaverses. Would transparency be that model? So would governments saying to, let's say, I'm just going to use Apple as an example, saying to Apple, you must be transparent about all the data you collect, all the data that the firms that are suppliers to you, et cetera, collect, and how you plan to use that data to provide goods and services. Would that be helpful or no? If we wanted to move to a world where you disincentivize that model as opposed to other models.
I think the devil's in the details, because all of this technology is so new. There's not a lot of understanding about analogs from one legal regime to the current one that's evolving. I say this because over the weekend I was speaking for Atlantic Council. I also spoke at RightsCon, and somebody brought up a great point. They said, I think this was Kurt Opschel of EFF, who said, privacy law regimes are predicated upon scarcity. Is that the same underlying assumption we're making about digital worlds? And it got me thinking about digital advertising, where they resell the same space again and again and again for different viewers or users in different experiences or different zip codes. So I think it's about more closely paying attention to how we are going to define the essential aspects of that old business model. What does targeted advertising look like in the metaverse? What does an impression, where in social media you pay for impressions, is that dependent upon eye tracking? Is it dependent upon a gesture? How are companies supposed to tell? What are they going to charge for? That's kind of being as blunt as I can about it. I wrote a paper for the Stanford Journal of Online Trust and Safety called "In AR VR, Nobody Knows You're an Ad." And it talks about how advertising in this industry does not look like product placement. It looks like placement in the product, and traces the way it has looked in the last 30 years, pulling from sports, media, cinema, and video games to show you that advertising has been there since the beginning. It's already there. It just doesn't look like a billboard. It looks like me paying to go into the Jurassic Park experience, to have the Jurassic Park experience advertised to me, to feed and pet dinosaurs. This is not, they have many experiences, but they're all intrinsically an advertisement for the movie franchise. And I seek it out and I like it because it's entertaining and artistic and fun. That is a very different model of advertising than getting a pop-up ad or getting some spam email. So I think we're going to have to push ourselves to be deliberate and specific about the type of measurements, technology, and not just the collection of data, but how that data is applied, used, stored, and monetized to, which means I'm now done answering because I've gone back to your original premise. So
Think of other ways, like HIPAA. So there's some data that we do a good job of protecting, and we don't say is for sale, like medical data. I mean, why not apply that model in this case as data becomes closer to the body again? I'm not in policy at all, so maybe the suggestion is super naive, but it strikes me.
No, I don't think it's naive at all. I never considered myself a privacy person before I started getting interested in AR/VR 5 years ago. And one of the things that shocked me was to find that biometrics and the concept of privacy in itself is centered around the concept of personal identifying data. And HIPAA protects your personal identifying data, what uniquely sets you apart from others. And as I got to understand how this all works and the neurology behind it that made it feel like magic, I came to the conclusion that companies know who I am. I sign in with my Facebook login. I have a verifiable billing address. It's more like the internet in 1996, where anonymity wasn't really a thing, you know? And so I think that's what I mean when I talk about concepts of mental privacy, where it's not as much about who I am, they know that. It's about my thoughts, my feelings, and my preferences, and how that can be extrapolated from participation in this new form. So I don't think you're wrong. I think HIPAA and medical data have a role to play, but I think we need to understand what HIPAA looks like when you're in a 3D environment.
One other dimension to the data discussion, which is, I think, a lot of the data focuses on data that we give up as users give up in the ways we're describing as users of these tools. Obviously, because of the focus of my work, I focus a lot on bystander privacy, which is a very anodyne phrase. They're not bystanders, they're the rest of the world who just happens to walk in front of us when we wear smart glasses or we film. And I think really understanding how we're going to grapple with it, we're gathering data about locations and spaces and other people in a much more omnivorous way. And you see that, of course, in the discussion around smart glasses to date, and you know how inadequate most of the ways we signal, right? If you wear, you know, Facebook Ray-Bans, the Facebook stories, I've worn them and people have barely noticed I'm wearing them. I used to wear Google Glass, that was a little more obvious. What you have in those contexts is a lot of gathering of data around you, and of course AR is dependent on mapping the world around you. And I think we really need to think there about actually like who has control in that space, right? At the moment, a lot of that control essentially sits with the device manufacturer in the the parameters of the hardware, the policies they set, and the user, but gives almost no control to the people who are in their field of vision, who are documented. So a lot of what we need to do is start thinking actually how are we enabling people who are exposed in AR environments to have more control about whether they wish to be part of that. And we haven't done enough in that. And I know there's a lot of pushback to actually saying it's not so much about whether you have good lights on your glasses and good policies on how you gather data, but actually how do you give power to the people who are around you, who may be in fact the people who have almost no agency in this area. And I think we have to think about their data and their presence as much as we do about our data that we give up when we choose to put on devices and choose to participate in those ecosystems.
I'm the moderator, so I don't know if I'm allowed to comment, but I'm going to.
Go ahead.
Sure. You raised a really good point about HIPAA, and we've discussed as part of this conversation how some of the information that is collected and used to facilitate the immersive experience could also indicate things about a person's cognitive state, potentially early indication of cognitive disorders, that sort of thing. And there are a lot of really miraculous uses of this technology for therapeutics and patient care. So I think something to think about is the information itself, the nature of the data versus the intent behind why it's collected and how it's used. So I don't have an answer to that question, but just putting it out there is something to think about.
I think also to kind of piggyback off of Sam's excellent point that if we are focusing on regulating the hardware before the hardscape is finalized, we're going to be it's going to be a Sisyphean task. I haven't talked about this with Sam, but maybe one day when we're all in the same place, I'll ask more about the wearables that disappear on our bodies. Many people have focused on bystander notification as being in the stems of glasses, but what are you going to do when those really awesome contact lenses that are in beta testing now and allow for digital overlays on what I see? Like, how am I going to indicate I'm wearing contact lenses to bystanders? That's a whole different question, right? So maybe we don't make these regulations and identification predicated on a certain form factor, but rather on like I think the Washington table has said the collection and application.
I want to circle back on the topic of deepfakes, especially because I feel this conversation always gravitates toward negative uses of deepfakes and the dangers of it. But there's some, I believe there could be some potential positive uses like education, grief therapy, or even political expression. And I think that it might get a little bit more murky because at one point, you're gonna be able to define the positive from the negative, and sometimes you can answer it intuitively is consent, but in some cases consent, especially in scenarios like history or grief therapy, might be impossible or impractical. In the case of political discourse, might even be unsafe. So I just want to get your thoughts on that.
This is a subject that's very close to my heart because we're doing a lot of work at Witness on deepfakes and satire currently, which is one of the best examples where, in some sense, satire is often in the eyes of the beholder, and it's very hard to draw the lines around when it's deceptive, when it's malicious, when it's gaslighting. I think there's a lot we can learn actually from what's happening in the deepfake space now around what we're going to need to prepare for in the XR space. And so a lot of the discussion in that space is around disclosure. So what are the ways in which you disclose that something is synthesized in ways that are medium appropriate, right? So what that means is in a creative production, maybe you don't need to tell people it's a deepfake, and that would in fact prevent it having its creative effect. Maybe in grief therapy, you definitely don't want to do that, or you maybe want to do something. We saw this in a film that was used when they were trying to anonymize the identities of LGBTQ activists. They were lifelike, but they had a halo. So you always knew that they were not real, but real, right? So it was like giving this signal of disclosure that was entirely sort of contextually appropriate. And so I think a lot of the thinking we need to do in XR spaces is actually how do you disclose the kind of gradations of reality, and how do you do that in ways, some of which are visible and some of which are not visible. So a lot of the other work in the deepfake space is around like authenticity and like how you show people how something was made, right? And it's generally at the moment looking at video and audio deepfakes and audio material. And it's a very challenging thing how that works in a VR or an AR space or an XR space. But I think you want that because you're right, there are plenty of, obviously XR is deepfakes on steroids in some sense, right? It's like synthetic reality. And there are tremendously creative potentials of those and tremendous pro-social potentials. But the question of how you disclose, and the reason I started with the satire example is what we saw in our research, a lot of people taking satirical deepfakes, and then they lose their context and people think they're mis and disinformation, or people create something deliberately malicious, and then a few days later, once it's been released, they say, actually, you didn't get the joke. That was not supposed to deceive you, that was a joke, right? So our ability to understand without context why someone made something that's photorealistic is very hard. And so we need these disclosures.
Yeah, I've stopped calling them deepfakes. I've started calling it synthetic media because there are many positive applications for it, like simultaneous translation or applications for Gestalt therapy, or even the digital resurrection that have been used for advocacy and education. Henry Adger has a podcast with the BBC that talks a lot about synthetic media, deepfakes, and XR, if you wanted to delve a little more into some of the concrete examples.
Also, I'd like to add, I mean, I agree with everything said, but there is something different with, let's call it deepfakes or synthetic media in virtual reality, which is, of course, you always know you're in virtual reality because you put on the head-mounted display, you know everything is fake, but that doesn't stop you responding as if it's real. So this is not a question of belief, it's how your automatic system responds. So it's very different to a video. So in a video, you may see a deep fake of a politician saying nasty things and so on. Now imagine the same in virtual reality, or even augmented reality. The politician standing there in front of you in your space, he or she looks at you and says, "Don't you agree?" and looks you in the eye. This is a really different experience to watching something on video. And we know from all our lives that the video isn't real, it never responds to you. But now when you have this kind of spatial proximity responding to your actions, you know it's not real, but this doesn't change the fact that it still affects you at a very deep level. So it's a very difficult problem to know how this may be overcome in these immersive systems.
If I could just add, I think on one hand, the distinction between real and fake is really unhelpful because we don't go to like a theater play and say, well, that was fake. We go there to engage with it, right? I mean, it's not about the frame of fake or real. So I really appreciate what you're pointing out, Mel, about how people respond because these are meaningful experiences. I mean, if they're successfully designed, that's like the point. At the same time, there is some need to kind of balance that with a level of literacy about technology. And I think equity in CS education still has a long way to go in terms of enabling people to become informed authors, really, not only passive consumers. Think about like the history of photography and then the issue of fakes in early photography, and then coming to the brownie camera when everybody could become an author or a creator in photography. We really aren't there. I think not only in XR technology, but even just in the computational medium at large. Like there's a lack of equity in CS education much more broadly. So I feel like that also needs to come in to kind of temper some of the reality of the way we engage these media that really aren't fake, right? They're part of real life. We're already post-digital. We're completely integrated with these systems.
I agree that just one other thing in the virtual reality is never really passive. So as I said, the politician looks you in the eye and says, "Do you agree?" Already you're engaged. It's not just a passive observation. Your whole system responds. So it's a bit more difficult, I think, to understand how to deal with this kind of thing. I mean, it's beyond my knowledge about how this kind of thing should be addressed.
I think there are other like non-digital interactive systems that we see too, where that aren't passive, right? Like immersive theater. There might not be a ton of technology like on stage in those experiences, like Sleep No More, but you are immersed in the space and engaged bodily in a way that's different from sitting in a seat in an audience. And even when we think about books as a passive medium, then of course there's the whole genre of the movable book, the interactive book, pop-up books, for example, where the body is engaging texture, activity, and so forth. So maybe there's something we can learn from some of those pre-digital systems too.
Interesting talk about the empathy machine, because I think storytelling or fictional simulation has always been our empathy machine, but the empathy is a means, not an end. Many times empathies pacify the propensity to act. And so isn't the goal sociality, working with each other, not social media, where we're ranting and reacting to each other, but cooperating? The question is, instead of measuring the individual, how are we measuring the social engagement, the human connection, to increase and enhance the sociality, which right now we're seeing in social media is more social deconstruction or division. How do we measure sociality? That's a really thing I'm curious about.
That's a great question. I mean, I think part of the problem is the way these systems are designed. Coalition building isn't like a core foundational value, you know, of those systems, right? I mean, they're interested in identifying people as individuals, you know, to sell things to, right? So, I mean, I think we would have to look very intentionally at the foundational, like structural design of systems to encourage coalition building across difference. And I think it's a great idea.
Again, I'll make a comment which to say about 5 or 6 years ago in my own organization, we were looking at whether we should do more work in VR at the sort of the height of the empathy machine discussion. And we decided not to. And the reason was because of this emphasis on empathy, rather than what we framed it as solidarity, but like collective action. And in fact, what we started doing work on was live streaming, because it was much easier to see there how you could form collective action around a shared experience, right? Which I think is what you're describing. And hopefully we're moving to a space now where there is a better ability to use VR and XR as a tool to build collective action, because we can interact, we can do things together in a meaningful way. But very good from our experience was the discovery we were not creating social action, we were creating very individualized feelings rather than collective action in that. And so we were doing live streaming work in very purposeful ways, people taking action together in live streams that were in crisis context. So, but I don't, the research now would be super interesting to see and to understand how it's.
One of the best experiences I've seen in VR to this date, it's a couple years old, but it really engenders intimacy between strangers in a way that is very rarely possible if you're seated next to somebody in a room and you don't know who they are. It's called Where Thoughts Go. And it asks this series of increasingly personal questions, like, tell me about the first time you fell in love. If you knew you were going to die a year from today, how would you change your life? If you could have one final conversation with someone you can't speak with today, who would you talk to and what would you say? And you record these answers in these little spheres, and then you release them into the sky. And part of the experience is that you can go into it and pull down these orbs and listen to the answer of people who came before you. And it is profound and touching. And even though you don't know who these people are, you feel this strong sense of connection. It's not empathy, because you're not feeling what they're feeling, right? It's immediacy. And and maybe if I can pull from Sam a bit of solidarity, because it makes people feel like they're not alone. I think that's part of the promise and the potential of this medium, where we've been talking a lot about the scary aspects of it if we don't look at human rights and safety and privacy. But I love it. I love it because it reminds me of how good we can be and how we can augment human potential and not just technology.
So this is somewhat counterintuitive, but to go back to your point on measuring collective efficacy, So the military has actually been looking at this in depth. Obviously, we know when it comes to small scale soldier performance that battlefield performance is fundamentally better when you train as a small team. So we're constantly trying to figure out ways to measure the efficacy of small teams of collectives and figure out ways where we can create that kind of shared experience. So as we start to measure this more in synthetic environments, it's a really interesting avenue from a research standpoint. So while this is very different than thinking about this from a human rights perspective, I think from a method standpoint, some of the methods from a measurement standpoint are probably very similar. So that might actually be an interesting place to look at from a source of inquiry standpoint.
Yeah, so the Ferrari example, I think, is potentially even more concerning. And so I want to understand, like, how are you considering the future systemic implications of this? So the Ferrari example, you talk about getting the ads, but then that goes to your insurance company because you were driving fast, so your rates go up. Then it goes to your healthcare company because, oh, all of those symptoms show that you have some precondition that we haven't been charging you for, and by the way, we're also going to deny your insurance. And so how are you considering the follow-on effects of all these systems that might not be directly implicated in the data collection or the specific privacy, especially as you said, the individualized privacy. And Britton, I think you mentioned that we're looking backwards to legal frameworks that don't even address the situation we're in. What happens when insurance markets completely readjust, because insurance had a huge impact on economic, social, historical structure. So are you thinking about that? Is that too far down the line? Can we do some of that work now so we avoid the potential human rights abuses in the future?
To clarify, the Ferrari example and biometric psychography, it's possible today, and luckily, and you can trace some patents that were filed over the last year to see companies moving that way. I am not aware of a company actually doing it in the way I described yet. So that should make you feel a little better, because it still gives time to for us to look at the applications of this data and to say, perhaps this data should never be sold. Perhaps targeted advertising should not occur because of the risks of the Ferrari example, right? So I'm not ready to give up the ship yet. I've been thinking a lot about pirates today with my nephews, but I do see trouble brewing on the horizon if we're not conscious and don't inform lawmakers not just about the potential effects of this, but how it works, so that they understand the moment to act is now, and not to create a retrospective patch after the pirates have already sunk the ship.
I'll say one thing on that, which is I really appreciate that we need to think broadly about this, and I think we should take up the challenge to think much more long term about where this plays out. I'll say from the perspective where I sit, there's a first step that we're still missing, which is there's still not a globally inclusive discussion about these, right? So there is not sufficient discussion about these technologies amongst human rights communities globally, amongst people who have never heard about AR and VR and XR, but will be as directly impacted because they live in places with worse legislation, worse governments, worse surveillance, worse precedents. And so, the step that I would encourage us to do is, when I think about the harms from AR and VR, I'm making suppositions, because I don't think we've done a full check with folks who have lived and professional and similar experience of all the different problems this relates to ask them what they're worried about and what they'd like to see done. So I think I want to do two steps. I think we haven't laid the foundations of thinking about what we need to be worried about, and I would love us also to then look further ahead, because you're right, there's like lots of spill-on effects. But I think we're missing a first step that we need to take first.
This has been a fabulous discussion, which unfortunately I have to bring to a close, which I feel ashamed about, or maybe more upset than ashamed, but thank you so much. Thank you.